Some cities are destroyed. Others are simply forgotten. 1,000 years ago, on a floodplain in what is now Illinois, a city rose out of nothing. Bigger than London, bigger than Paris, home to 20,000 people at a time when most of Europe still lived in scattered villages. They built pyramids here, not of stone, of earth, carried on human backs, one basket at a time, until a single mound stood 10 stories tall, with a base as wide as the Great Pyramid of Giza. And then, sometime around the year 1350, they walked away. Every last one of them. They left no marble temples, no carved kings, no written name. They left mounds of dirt and silence. By the time European settlers arrived, the city had been empty for centuries. The tribes living nearby had no memory of who built it, no story, no song, nothing. It was as if 20,000 people had agreed, all at once, to erase themselves from history. We call the place Cahokia, but that is not its real name. Nobody alive knows what its real name was. So sit with 3 questions for a moment. Who were these people who raised the largest city in ancient North America and then disappeared? What did they bury inside their holiest mound that archaeologists still struggle to explain? And how does a civilization this vast vanish so completely that even its neighbors forget it was ever there? By the end of this video, you will see how a quiet dig uncovered a dark ceremony frozen in the earth, why every clean theory for the city's collapse keeps falling apart, and why the most important lost city on the planet might be the one almost no one has heard of. This is the story of America's forgotten metropolis. Chapter 1. The city that shouldn't exist. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand the scale. And the scale is almost impossible to believe. Picture the Mississippi River, a few miles east of where St. Louis stands today. Flat floodplain, rich black soil, a wide, slow horizon. For centuries, small farming villages dotted this land. Ordinary, scattered, quiet. And then, around the year 1050, something happened that archaeologists call the Big Bang. Almost overnight, in the span of a single generation, one of those villages was leveled, flattened, wiped clean, and on top of it, someone began to build a city. Not a city that grew slowly over centuries the way cities usually do, a city that was planned, laid out, willed into existence as if by a single vision. At its heart, they raised a mountain. We call it Monk's Mound today, named after French monks who lived nearby much later. The builder's own name for it is gone. It climbs 100 feet into the air, nearly 1,000 feet long at the base, wide enough to cover the footprint of the Great Pyramid of Giza. But this is the part that stops archaeologists cold. There were no machines, no wheels, no pack animals, no metal tools of any kind. Every ounce of that mountain, an estimated 15 billion pounds of earth, was dug by hand, packed into woven baskets, and carried up the slope on the shoulders of ordinary people, basket after basket, for decades. No machine shaped this, just people and baskets, and a belief strong enough to move a mountain one handful at a time. So how did it happen? How does a city like this explode out of a floodplain in a single lifetime? The answer begins with a seed: corn. In the generations before Cahokia rose, a hardier strain of maize spread through these river valleys, and for the first time the land could feed a true crowd. A large one. Surplus food freed thousands of hands from the daily hunt to survive, and free hands could be pointed at something greater, at mounds, at monuments, at a shared idea. And Cahokia knew how to bind a crowd together. They played a game called Chunky. A player would roll a polished stone disc across the open plaza, and men would hurl their spears at the spot where they believed it would come to rest. Thousands gathered to watch, to roar, to gamble everything they owned on a single throw. It was sport and ritual and glue all at once. A way to make 20,000 strangers feel like one people. Stand at the summit of the great mound, and the whole city opens beneath you. A grand plaza the size of 30 football fields swept flat for ceremony. Neighborhoods of thatched homes stretching toward the tree line. More than 120 mounds rising like waves across the plain. And to the west, a ring of towering wooden posts. Archaeologists named it Woodhenge, because, just like its famous cousin in England, it was built to catch the sun. Stand at its center on the morning of the spring equinox, and the sunrise breaks directly over a single marked post, as if the sky itself were keeping an appointment. Now imagine one of the great festival days. Smoke from 1,000 cooking fires drifting over the rooftops, drums rolling across the plaza, traders from distant nations moving through the crowd, carrying seashells up from the Gulf of Mexico and copper down from the Great Lakes. And far above it all, on the flattened summit of the mountain, the small, distant figures of the rulers standing against the open sky. 20,000 people lived here. Let that number settle. In the year 1250, this city on the Mississippi was larger than London. It would stay the largest city in what is now the United States until Philadelphia finally passed it, around the year 1800. For more than 500 years, the biggest city in America was one that America had completely forgotten. These people had astronomy, city planning, a trade network that reached half a continent. They had everything a great civilization needs, everything except one thing. They left us no words, no writing, no records, no name for themselves, which means every single thing we know about them, we have to pull out of the ground. And when archaeologists dug into one particular mound, a low, unremarkable ridge known only by a number, they found something that turned a story of triumph into something much darker. Chapter 2. The Birdman. The mound was called Mound 72. From the outside, nothing about it stood out. Low, narrow, easy to lose among the giants around it. For years, almost no one paid it any attention. Then they opened it. Inside, pressed into the earth, were the remains of nearly 300 people. This was not a random graveyard, not the ordinary dead of a busy city. This was staged, arranged, deliberate. At the very center lay a single man, and the way he was buried tells you at once that he was not like the others. Beneath his body, someone had laid down a blanket of more than 20,000 seashell beads, each one carried from a distant coast, each one placed by hand. Together, they formed the shape of a great bird, a falcon, wings spread wide, as if frozen in the middle of flight. Archaeologists call him the Birdman, and the falcon was no accident. Across the Mississippian world, the Birdman, part human, part hunting hawk, was a sacred figure, a creature of the upper world, a symbol of warriors and of the sun. To be laid inside a falcon of shells was to be launched skyward, remade as something more than a man. This was not only a burial, it was a crowning for the world to come. If the story stopped there, it would simply be the grave of a king. It does not stop there. Around the Birdman, the earth gave up its darker secrets. In one pit, lay the bodies of more than 50 young women, all of them roughly the same age, late teens to early 20s, laid out in careful, ordered rows. They did not die of sickness. They did not die of age. The evidence points to something colder. They were killed together in a single ceremony so they could be buried beside the powerful. And in another pit, the story turns worse still. A cluster of bodies thrown down in a way the others were not. And when archaeologists studied the hands of some of these people, they found the fingers curled, clawing, locked in the act of reaching upward into the dirt above them. Some of the people in that pit had been buried alive. These were not random victims. Many, archaeologists believe, were retainers, servants and attendants and offerings sent into the ground so they could keep serving the powerful on the far side of death. Stop for a moment and picture what this mound truly is. It is not only a tomb. It is a record of power so absolute that human lives could be spent like currency, to honor one man, to seal one moment into the earth. This is the uncomfortable truth beneath all that grandeur. The same society that charted the stars and moved mountains of soil by hand also staged mass human sacrifice and buried it in its holiest ground. Brilliance and horror folded into the same hill, and it leaves one question hanging over everything. A civilization this organized, this powerful, this able to bend thousands of people to a single will. How does a place like that simply stop? Chapter 3. The Vanishing. For about a century and a half, Cahokia burned bright. Then, slowly, the light began to fade. Around the year 1200, the city started to change. The people raised a massive wooden wall, a stockade nearly 2 miles long, straight through the heart of the city, sealing the great plaza off from the neighborhoods around it. You do not build a wall like that in a time of peace. Something had shifted. Fear had moved in. Whatever the danger was, an enemy outside the walls or an enemy within them, the great open city of ceremony was quietly turning into a fortress. Over the next 100 years, the population thinned. Whole neighborhoods emptied, the mounds stopped rising, and by around 1350, the largest city in North America stood silent, abandoned, surrendered to the grass and the wind. The obvious question is also the hardest. Why? And for a long time, archaeologists believed they had the answer. The first theory was a kind of ecological suicide. A city of 20,000 people needs wood, for homes, for walls, for fire. The theory said the Cahokians stripped the surrounding hills bare, and with no trees to hold the soil, the rivers flooded, the fields drowned, and the city slowly starved itself to death. It is a clean story, a tidy warning for our own age. There is just one problem. When researchers went back and read the actual layers of sediment around the city, searching for the fingerprints of those catastrophic floods, the floods were not there. The Great Flood theory dried up, so attention turned to the sky, to drought. A long dry spell, a run of failed harvests, could certainly break a farming city. It is plausible. But the newest studies, reading chemical isotopes locked deep in the soil, keep muddying the water. The people, it seems, may have had reasons to leave that had little to do with the rain. There are even signs that the earth itself turned against them. Cahokia sits on the edge of the New Madrid seismic zone, one of the most active fault systems in North America. And the evidence suggests powerful earthquakes struck the city more than once, toppling buildings, and perhaps shaking something harder to rebuild than any wall. The people's faith that their rulers and their gods could hold the world together. So here is the honest answer, the the one careful archaeologists will actually give you. We do not know why Cahokia fell, not for certain. What is emerging instead is something more unsettling than any single disaster. Not one clean blow, but many tangled together. A rigid order in which a small elite held enormous power while the people at the bottom carried the weight. Rulers who could not bend when the pressure finally came. Perhaps drought, perhaps disease, perhaps a slow collapse of belief in the leaders who had promised so much. A civilization that lost the story it had been telling about itself. And the people themselves did not simply die. They scattered, breaking into smaller bands, drifting out across the continent, folding into the many nations we still know today. The blood of Cahokia was never lost, only the memory. Because when the last families finally walked away, they did not only abandon a city, they abandoned the memory of it. By the time Europeans stood beneath Monk's Mound, the native nations of the region told them nothing about it. No legend of the great city, no name for its builders, no story of the 20,000 who had once filled that plain. A silence so complete that some researchers wonder whether it was a choice, whether whatever ended here was so painful or so shameful that the people who scattered agreed, without ever writing a word, never to speak of it again. A civilization did not simply fall, it erased itself. Chapter 4. The question the Mounds won't answer. We like to believe that lost cities belong somewhere else. The jungles of the Yucatan, the deserts of Egypt, always far away and long ago. But Cahokia is none of those things. It sits in the American Midwest, a short drive from a major modern city, beside an interstate highway, within sight of gas stations and fast food signs. For most of American history, people drove past those mounds and saw nothing but hills. Early settlers were so unwilling to believe that Native Americans had built something this vast that they invented stories to explain it away. A lost race of giants, wanderers from Atlantis, anyone at all except the ancestors of the people who were actually standing right there. It took generations for the simple truth to be accepted, that the largest ancient city north of Mexico was raised by Native Americans, on American soil, and then forgotten on that same soil. Cahokia was forgotten twice, first by history, when its people scattered, then by prejudice, when newcomers refused to believe who had built it. Today, Cahokia is a protected World Heritage Site, studied, mapped, slowly surrendering its secrets, one season of digging at a time. The work is far from finished. Every year, new tools and new tests pull a little more of the story out of the dirt, and somehow the story only grows deeper and stranger. But the deepest mystery here was never really about floods, or drought, or walls. It is about memory. Try to imagine understanding New York 1,000 years from now if every book, every screen, every photograph, and every tower had crumbled into nothing. Only the foundations left in the soil. How much of that world would a future digger get wrong? How much would simply be lost forever? That is roughly where we stand with Cahokia, a city we can walk across and still barely read. 20,000 people built a wonder of the world out of earth and sheer will. They read the sunrise from the top of a man-made mountain. They wrapped their rulers in blankets of shell and pressed their sacrifice into silent rows. And then they vanished so thoroughly that their own descendants forgot they had ever lived. Cahokia is not really a story about ruins. It is a story about how easily the largest things we build can slip out of memory. How a place can hold 20,000 lives and 1,000 years later hold none, and be mistaken for the natural shape of the land. So this is the question the Mounds leave you holding. If a city this large, this advanced, this close to home, can fall out of human memory so completely that we had to rediscover it as strangers, what else are we standing on top of, right now, certain that we already know the whole story? What do we walk past every single day and dismiss as nothing more than a hill? The people of Cahokia never left us their name, but they did leave us a warning, written in earth, that no city, no empire, no way of living is ever as permanent as the people inside it believe. Not theirs, and not ours.